Hi everyone, this is Smart. Welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk to you about writing a PhD research proposal. Now, back in the day, I've written a few of those myself, and then later as time passed by, I started asking students to write them for me. And I can definitely give you lots of really good tips how to write a successful PhD research proposal and to make sure that you secure this PhD funding, that you get into this PhD program. And in the end of this video, I'm going to show you two different PhD research proposals so that you see how different they can be in terms of the length and also in terms of the sections they include. First of all, your PhD research proposal is really all about the prep you do before, which is reading papers and understanding them. Because the purpose of this proposal is to instill confidence in the examiners, in the reviewers, but you really understand the field. You know exactly where the research gap is and how to tackle it. You know the significance of the research gap and why you really should study what you want to study, why we need to know this. And you know the methods. And you know which methods are good and which methods are not so good for tackling your research gap. And also you understand the limitations of these methods. That's really key. That really shows deep understanding when you understand the limitations and you can come up with alternatives with a plan B. Because this will really make the panel feel like, yes, this person really thought it through. They know what they're doing. They are quite realistic about this. They know that things might go wrong and they have a plan B or even plan C, which is brilliant, which gives them that reassurance that if they spend money on you, on your research project, then they will get something back. Ideally, they will get papers out of it. So they're really investing in you to get papers out of you. This is the sort of, give and take situation. And you need to make them feel confident that you are going to deliver on this promise. The research proposals can be very different in terms of the length and the sections. So you really need to speak to your department of a university to see what they expect. So I can tell you from my own experience that the shortest PhD research proposals I've seen were only 2 pages long, and they were still successful because this is what the university wanted. And also, I've seen PhD proposals that were 10,000 words long. So lots of pages. And that was also fine, that was successful because this is what the university wanted. So you really need to speak to them and see what the requirements are. When you open any PhD research proposal, you will see the title on top. However, the title is something you write probably in the end, and you come up with the title with your supervisor because the title needs to be only 10-15 words long. And as you will describe your research and you will improve the wording and the language and write the next versions together with your supervisor, you will see that the general aim will slightly change. So, title is something that you will really want to write in the end together with your supervisor, and it only needs to be 10 to 15 words long. And ideally, it really needs to carry the essence of your research, what you want to do, and what you're going to deliver. After the title, you might have an abstract. Now, this abstract will be fairly short, and not every university will require you to write an abstract, but let's say that this is going to be 100 words here, and really all you need to talk about here is a little bit of a background information, your research gap, and then your aims. So it's brief, it's simple, and to be honest, not every university will want you to write an abstract. So don't worry about it too much and write it much later once you finish the body of your research proposal. The next part of your PhD research proposal will be the background, the literature review. Now, this is going to be maybe 500 words long. And remember, what is really important here is that you start really broad, right? Because you only have 500 words, remember. And you need to start very broad and you need to finish with a research gap. So very quickly you narrow down. So for example, my field was biology, and within biology it was how cells repair damaged DNA. So we call it DNA damage repair. So this is where I would start. This was the broad field. And then I would very quickly narrow this down to these little things called R loops, which is what I was really interested in. And this was the narrow field. And then within these, I identified the gap, what was unknown. So remember, when you write these 500 words, you narrow down really quickly to the research gap and you make sure that you have all the references there. And once you define the research gap, then you move to the next section, which is your research questions and aims. And here, basically, you just describe what are your big aims, what you really want to do during your PhD. And from there, it's going to be a quite short section. You move to methods. And now, methods are absolutely key. And this is really what makes the difference between a good PhD proposal and an outstanding PhD proposal. Because you see, everyone can read the papers and find the research gap. That is not that difficult. But what is really difficult is to come up with a plan, find the right experiments to address your research questions, and then also understand the limitations of these experiments, of these methods, and come up with alternatives. So you really need to make sure that here you also use references, you explain and justify which methods are the best to answer your research questions. And then you also talk about their limitations and you suggest alternatives. So, what other experiments can you do? What could you change to make sure that you come up with answers to your research questions, right? That's so important. And also talk about stats, about your statistical approach. It might be just a t-test, it might be ANOVA, but at least write a couple of sentences what statistics you want to perform. And as you read the papers, when you prep for writing these PhD research proposals, you will see what statistical methods people use. And very likely, you might be able to use exactly the same statistical methods. And even if you're wrong, then remember, when you send this proposal to your supervisor, to your prospective supervisor, they will look through this and they will give you feedback before this goes further down to the research funding panel, whatever it is. So your supervisor will help you with this, but at least give them something and prove to them that you already thought about it. You thought about statistics, because this is also really, really important. After the methods, you could have a section which is called significance or contributions. And that is a fairly short section again, that is only talking about why we should do your research, why we should spend money on this. So why is it important and how it's going to improve our understanding and well-being, health, whatever it is. We need to justify why it's worth spending money on this research. So this is your significance, and following your significance will be the timeline. And that's also a really important section that distinguishes between an outstanding research proposal and, a good research proposal. So that in the timeline section, you give them a table or maybe a Gantt chart. It doesn't really matter so much what it is. I know people like Gantt charts because they look cool. However, from my perspective of an academic, it doesn't really matter. It's the substance. And what I want to see is that you divide your PhD, for example, into semesters, from semester 1 to semester 6 or semester 8, however long your PhD is going to be. And then you are going to write what you're going to do within each semester. So these are your milestones. Probably, the very first semester will be just all about reading papers, and then you will start doing experiments. Now, as you're doing experiments, you will start getting data, and then you can start thinking of also, producing papers, right? Publishing all of your work. And remember, this is what the academics are looking for the most. This is what they want. They want that output. They want the papers. So include in your milestones, start drafting a paper. So for example, maybe, after 2 years of your PhD, you will start writing a paper. It will take you 3 months to write a paper, and then you will submit this paper, and then you will, a month later receive comments and start working on these comments from the reviewers, from the journal, and then finalize the paper. So maybe, it will take you a full year, or you start with writing for 3 months and then addressing comments for 3 months or so on. I said this just based on my experience within biology, but maybe your field is different. However, make sure that you have this output there, that you're going to produce a paper and you're going to publish a paper, that you're aiming for it. I think that's really important, and it just looks well on a PhD research proposal. The next section you might have there is the budget. So What we want to see is that your plan, your experimental plan, is actually within the budget you're going to be given. Now, this is quite difficult to write, and you might really have no clue whether, for example, $10,000, £10,000, whatever it is that you're going to get for your research every year is going to be enough. But at least have a section where maybe just write a very short justification, just saying that your research is really not going to cost much because you will mostly use surveys, or maybe your research is going to be, fairly expensive because it's going to be in a wet lab, and you will ask your supervisor, your prospective supervisor, or anyone else in his lab to help you to write this section to justify that actually your PhD research is within the budget. So you will need the help from someone to write this, but you know what? You never know, maybe your university will not require this section. However, from a point of view of a biologist, I can tell you straight away that £5,000 a year in the UK for doing biology research only for consumables should be enough, and a lot of programs are offering exactly that amount of money. So if this is what you were offered within biology in the UK, then you might as well say that this is the standard amount of money offered for PhD programs like yours. And that's it, and that should be enough. But obviously check this with someone from your supervisor's lab. The next section you might want to include is ethics. Now, ethics is really important if you're going to work with people. This might mean, just sending out surveys, or it might mean working with human tissues, or working with animals as well. This is when you will need ethics. And here you can just write again a couple of sentences with the help of your supervisor. They will definitely help you with this. Just show them that you thought about it and you're aware that you need to write a section regarding the ethics. And it can be just one or two sentences, that's it. We're just looking for that awareness. The next section they might want from you is justification why you and why this university, why this group. So this is basically a very short cover letter for you to explain why you are the right person, but you have a skill set and knowledge to do this. So for example, for me, it was quite easy when I moved to my PhD because I've done masters in DNA damage repair, and then I ended up doing a PhD in DNA damage repair. So I had the knowledge and I had the skill set, and I already knew the experimental techniques that I was going to do in my PhD because I've learned them throughout my undergrad and my masters. So this was quite easy for me to justify, and also the group I was going to work for was very, very good, and basically this is why I wanted to work for them. And then finally, you will have your references section, right? Now, when you do your references, remember, don't write them by hand. Always use software. Use something like Mendeley or Zotero because these are referencing managers that will just do your references in a couple of seconds, or sort them all out, and make sure that there are no mistakes. And this just saves you time and looks professional. This is essentially everything that needs to go into your PhD research proposal. But as you write this, think about the language. The people on the panel may not be experts within your field, right? So the language needs to be fairly simple and accessible so anyone can understand. So it is a good idea to actually give your PhD research proposal to someone who is not an expert in your field, to make sure that they understand the gist of it, they understand what you're talking about, and they can get that feel that you are the right person. Now, it's very tempting to just start using complicated words, complicated language. But remember, this will not make you look smart. This will only confuse the reader. So try to avoid that. Make it simple, make it accessible, and this is really the best recipe for success. And if you talk about outcomes at any point, don't overpromise, don't be too specific, because remember, the PhD proposal is not so much about what you're going to get out of it, but what you're going to do and why it's important to research this. In the end of the day, you don't really know what you're going to get. I started with one PhD research topic and I ended up with a completely different one. Research will take you places you can't predict. Make sure that you focus on what you're going to do and why it's important to research this, rather than that you're going to deliver very, very specific things. And I'm sure that your supervisor will help you with this as well. And now, once you've written all of this, now actually would be the best time to write this abstract and write the title. And again, Title, of course, you will have to write, and I would suggest to write it together with your supervisor. The abstract is not that common, so you might actually get away without it. However, now let me show you a couple of examples of PhD research proposals so you see how different they can be. So what we have here is a PhD proposal. You can see that there is a very short title on top, and then there is an introduction. So let's scroll through the introduction. So it is about a page and a half long, and I can see some references here. And then there is a research question, actually 3 research questions. This is also fairly brief, just half a page. And then we have methods, another half a page. And then we can see contributions. So here, in this case, contributions are the significance. So what is important about the study, why we should do it. And then in the end, we have a couple of pages of references. And that's it. So let's have a look at the second PhD proposal now. So there's a slightly longer title here, and there is actually a small abstract to start with, and then we have the background. So this is our literature review. The literature review is what? Oh, it's a little bit longer here. So we have, well, 2 pages, maybe 2.5 pages. Then we have aim and research questions, which is only half a page or less than that. And then again, we have contributions, which means the significance, which was only half a page. And then we have a methodology, which is a little bit longer here. So it's about a page, page and a half. Then we also have resources, which is specific to this PhD study, to this PhD program. And then a short section on ethics and the timetable. You can see that the whole thing is about 2000 words long. And if you look at the timetable, we actually have a table that is divided into semesters or months 1 to 6, 6 to 12. And we have all 3 years of a PhD divided into 6 sections. And then finally, we have references. So this is it. Okay, I hope this was useful, this was helpful to you. Please let me know in the comments if you have any tips or suggestions on writing PhD research proposals. If you benefit from this content, please subscribe because it just keeps me motivated, and I will see you in the next one.